In today's grammar lesson, we're going to look at complex and compound complex sentences. Now, there are 4 sentence types in the English language. We have looked at 2 of them in the past, and we're going to look at 2 of them today. We'll first begin with a review. This is going to look back to a lesson we have done previously about simple and compound clauses. In a previous lesson, we looked at independent clauses. An independent clause must have 3 things. It must have a subject, a verb, and a complete thought. Let's look at these examples. Sally sings. Here we have our subject, Sally, and our verb, sings. This sentence may be very short, but it tells us everything that we need to know. She loves you. This is subject, verb, object, and again it contains a complete thought. The next sentence, we are going to the mall this weekend, tells us even more. But again, just one subject, just one verb, and it is expressing one complete thought. A dependent clause, on the other hand, does not express a complete thought. It will have a subject, it will have a verb, but it does not express a complete thought. You can identify a dependent clause because it will begin with a subordinating conjunction or a relative pronoun. This is why it cannot function as a complete sentence. These subordinating conjunctions and relative pronouns introduce an idea that needs to be finished across 2 clauses. Here we can see our 4 sentence types in English. We have the simple sentence, such as we play football. We have the compound sentence, we play football and they play rugby. We have our complex and compound complex sentences, which we will look at later in this lesson. In reviewing our first 2 sentence types, the simple and compound sentences, we note how here for the simple sentence we have just one independent clause. We, subject, verb, play, and football is our object. In the compound sentence, you can see we have 2 independent clauses joined by a comma and the word and. This is a coordinating conjunction. So simple sentences are just one independent clause. We can see another few examples. I like eating fast food. She went to the park yesterday. They were last seen 6 days ago. A compound sentence is made up of 2 or more independent clauses. They can be joined in 3 ways. Firstly, as we just saw in the previous example, they can be joined by a comma and a coordinating conjunction. We remember the coordinating conjunctions by this amusing name, fanboys. This stands for and, nor, but, or, yet, so. Here we can see we have the but, that is the B, and on the previous page we had the and, which is the A. I like tea, but I prefer coffee. we have our comma followed by but. If the meanings are very close and the relationship is obvious, we can use a semicolon to split our two independent clauses. I like tea, I prefer coffee. A semicolon and a conjunctive adverb can also be used. I like tea, however, I prefer coffee. In this case, the semicolon always comes first, the conjunctive adverb follows, and then there is a comma here. A conjunctive adverb is a word or a group of words that can join independent clauses. You might recognize however, therefore, meanwhile, and so on. There are 3 big mistakes to watch out for when you're writing sentences in English. The first that we'll talk about is a comma splice. A comma splice exists when you have 2 independent clauses and they are joined by just a comma. Now, a comma is not strong enough to hold together 2 independent clauses alone. This sentence we would need to change. You could change it in a few different ways, but one way would be to add a coordinating conjunction in here. The mountain is tall, so it's really dangerous. Or the mountain is tall and it's really dangerous. The next error is a sentence fragment, and this is a really common mistake. This is when you have a sentence made up of just a dependent clause. A dependent clause will begin with a word like although. This is a subordinator or subordinating conjunction. Now, a sentence like this is not really a sentence. We call it a fragment, meaning a part of something. It should be a part of a longer sentence, as a dependent clause always needs joined to an independent clause. This sentence cannot function alone, and so this would be a big mistake. We would need to expand it with an independent clause. Although the fog was really thick, she still went out driving. Finally, the run-on sentence is completely lacking in punctuation. We need to change this by identifying the clauses. The man came to the door. He said his name was Frank. We need something in the middle of here. I would suggest a period. Make this into 2 separate sentences. So let's begin looking at complex sentences. Now, a complex sentence is the most common sentence type in the English language. We use them all the time. They're quite varied, and it is important that you learn to use them. These add detail, color to our language. They're often used to give extra information about something, adding, for example, why something is the way it is. A complex sentence is made up of 1 independent clause and at least 1 dependent clause. The 2 clauses will be joined by, as we have seen already, a subordinator, such as although, because, since, as. Here we can see our example although. Although it was raining, I walked to work. We have our independent clause second, and we have our dependent clause here first. The subordinator is the word although. You can't see it so well here, but there is a comma in the middle, and I will explain that in a moment. Now, when we have a complex sentence, we can write it in one of 2 ways. We can put the dependent clause first, then a comma, then the independent clause. Or we can do it the other way around, independent clause and dependent clause, with no comma. When the dependent clause comes second, As we can see in this example, there should be no comma. When the dependent clause comes first, we need to use a comma. This is always the case with the complex sentences. It's not something we think about when we're speaking, but when we're writing, it is quite important. If you were to write down a formula of how to write a complex sentence, it would look like this. Independent plus dependent clause, or dependent clause, comma, independent clause. It is important to note that we can alter this sentence, we can edit it, but we cannot delete the independent clause and leave the dependent clause standing alone. As we saw earlier, this would be a sentence fragment. We can, however, delete the dependent clause and leave the independent clause, which would have a sentence like this: I walked to work. What we mean by complete thought is that this sentence stands alone. We have a subject, I, a verb, walked, and altogether I walked to work makes sense. However, this is a sentence fragment because we have our subject, it, our verb, was raining, but there is no complete idea. Although introduces something that is not met, it does not occur afterwards. So if we deleted the second clause, we would end up with a simple sentence. But we cannot delete the independent clause. This would give us a sentence fragment. I've talked a lot about subordinators, but in my examples so far, I've only shown you the word although. Here we can see a list of many subordinators. I'm sure they will seem very common to you. We need to be able to use them correctly, and we need to understand what they mean. When we're reading, we can see words like this, and they can tell us that this is a complex sentence. And when we're writing, if we ever use one of these words in a sentence that has only one clause, we know that we have made a mistake. There is another interesting element to dependent clauses. Now, another word for dependent clause is subordinate clause. You just saw a list of subordinators. Well, subordinate means less important than. That's why we call these words subordinators. They mark one part of a sentence as less important than the other. It is a slight distinction, but it is quite important nonetheless. We think of the dependent clause as less important than the independent clause. Its function is to support and add information to the independent clause. Let's look at these examples. Here we have two simple sentences. I was tired. I went to the shop. We can bring them together into a compound sentence. I was tired, but I went to the shop. In these cases, they have equal meaning. They are equally important. However, if we were to change this into a complex sentence, although I was tired, I went to the shop. Now we have changed the meaning because one of the clauses is more important than the other. In this case, I went to the shop is the main idea. It is the most important part. The tiredness is extra. Now you can see why our sentence construction is adding subtle or explicit meanings to our language. This is just one example of that. Let's look at some more examples of complex sentences. Here we can see an example of the independent clause coming first I can't do any work here, and the dependent clause, because it's too noisy, coming second. Our subordinator is the word because. You will know this is one of the most common words in English. We use it every day, and I'm sure you know how to use it pretty well. In this case, we can see a little closer what it is telling us. I can't do any work here is the most important thing. The fact that it's too noisy is secondary. It is less important. He will keep studying until he passes the exam. So until is our subordinator, and it tells us that until he passes the exam is less important than the fact that he will keep studying. In this case, we can see the dependent clause coming first. So now we have introduced a comma. When I first came here, I had no friends. Remember, the dependent clause comes first. We use the comma before we have the independent clause, I had no friends. Even though this independent clause comes second, it is still the most important part of the sentence. Let's take a few moments to review what we have just learned. In a complex sentence, we will have one independent clause and at least one dependent clause. The two parts of the sentence are not equal, unlike a compound sentence. We can put the independent clause first or second, but remember that the comma will only come in the middle of the sentence when the dependent clause is first. Here we can see an example about a poor guy called Bob. It's not all bad though, he is quite popular. Bob is popular even though he is ugly. Even though he is ugly, Bob is popular. Don't forget to put that comma right in the middle there. Next, we're going to look at compound complex sentences. This is the longest sentence type in English, or it usually is. It is also quite a difficult one to use. It has typically more clauses than the other sentence types. It is much less common, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time going into this. It's also not a great idea to use this type of sentence if your English is at a lower level. Say you're looking at IELTS band 5 to 6. A compound complex sentence is quite difficult to write and should be attempted by someone who is more comfortable at the 7 range. So what is a compound complex sentence? It must have at least 2 independent clauses and 1 dependent clause. We use the same conjunctions, that's our subordinators or fanboys, to join the different parts. A formula might look something like this, however, the clauses can be in any order. We might say independent, independent, dependent, independent, dependent, independent, or dependent, independent, independent. If that sounds a little confusing, let's look at some examples to understand it better. So here I have highlighted in red our subordinators and our coordinating conjunctions. In this case, we have the subordinator although. This tells us that the first sentence here is a dependent clause. As the dependent clause comes first, we follow with a comma. What happens next is an independent clause. Most people had never heard of her. And we join another independent clause by using a comma and the word and. We can tell then that these 2 sentences are the most important, and this is a supporting sentence. There are 3 clauses altogether. Here are 2 more examples. In this first one, we can see we begin with an independent clause. The dog barked loudly. We've got our comma in the word and. Then another independent clause. She ran all around the room. Finally, we end up with a dependent clause. Now we have another type here. The scouts did not think they'd make it to the destination. What kind of clause is this? It is independent. It is followed by a dependent clause because it was so far away. The dependent clause will be then followed by a comma and another independent clause, and they were exhausted from the long journey. Let's look at one more group of examples. Supermarkets are very popular, that is independent, because they sell so many things, that is dependent, and they often have other services, that's independent. The final one, Stanley went to work, but his wife stayed at home because she had a sore throat. Independent, independent, dependent. If you have found this grammar lesson useful, perhaps you would enjoy reading my book, Grammar for IELTS Writing. It is a short, simple guide to all the grammar you're going to need for your IELTS writing exam. You can find it on Amazon. If you've enjoyed this video, don't forget to give it a like, click subscribe, and I'll see you again next time.